Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We're a think tank based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm your host, Anthony Flint. In this series, we take a look behind the scenes at what really makes cities tick, the policies and innovations we're seeing in metropolitan regions around the country and all around the world. More often than not, the key elements of more sustainable, equitable, and livable cities can be traced back to land. In this episode, we're going to talk about something the Lincoln Institute's been tracking for many years, and that's informal settlement, otherwise known as favelas, shantytowns, or slums. The estimate varies, but the official UN projection is that about 1 billion people live in informal settlement in a range of conditions, but commonly without basic services like sanitation or clean water. Cities worldwide are growing by leaps and bounds, and the unplanned, informal settlement, mostly on the outer periphery, accounts for most of the urban expansion in many cases. How to confront this global phenomenon? On the one hand, a pattern that functions in its own way, but on the other hand, leaves so many people in substandard conditions, vulnerable to crime and climate change, and typically far away from formal economic opportunities. With me today are two very special guests to the Land Matters podcast, Enrique Silva, Director of International and Institute-wide Initiatives at the Lincoln Institute, and Teresa Williamson, founder of Catalytic Communities, an advocacy organization for favelas based in Rio. Enrique's done extensive research on informal settlement and organized a conference last year in collaboration with Harvard University's Graduate School of Design and the Joint Center for Housing Studies called Slums, New Visions for an Enduring Global Phenomenon. The mission of that forum was in part to advance ideas to help improve conditions in existing slums and generate alternatives to future unplanned settlement. Teresa Williamson, a city planner, has been a tireless advocate at Catalytic Communities, CATCOM for short, working on ways to maintain community control of favela communities and, most recently, helping establish community land trusts, an innovation that we'll talk about in just a bit. I want to start out with a high-level question. It may sound theoretical, but I think it's important. Should policymakers continue to look at slums as a problem to be solved? Teresa, let me start with you.
Well, first off, thanks so much, Anthony, for having me. It's an honor to be here. But just to answer this question, I think the word slums, I would say the answer is yes. Slums need to be solved. But informal settlements, no. And I think it's important to sort of understand the difference. And the term slum implies a level of precarity that we should all be concerned with addressing. That is a problem. And it's a policy failure to allow slums to develop in the first place. I think they exist mainly in societies where the state is incapable or unwilling to guarantee the basic needs of their citizens, or people in power in the case of Brazil. It's not that they're incapable, it's that there are actually groups in power that have an interest in maintaining inequality and poverty. So their existence is a failure of society. But, slums over time, they develop, and as we see in Rio's favelas, which have by far superseded what you might call slum conditions, people over generations are able to transform these communities into consolidated informal settlements. Now, they're still informal, not meeting, official planning regulations but they're consolidated, and often they become vibrant communities with innumerable assets. They might not be monetized assets, but they have all sorts of qualities that their residents recognize as important. And then once they're consolidated, I think the policy failure then, at that point, is to deny those achievements and then remove or evict them or neglect them. I think at that point governments need to invest in them with special care to actually maintain the qualities that have been developed over time. And I would say it's also important to note that for the vast majority of human existence, our settlements were informally developed. So to think of that as a problem is sort of to go against our own nature. Now, they might not have been slums because, the conditions weren't the same. These were different times. But they were informal. Almost all UNESCO World Heritage Sites in cities were developed informally. That's actually what maybe we could think of as normal. Whereas, formalization is the novelty. That's what's come in the last couple hundred years. We shoot ourselves in the foot if we automatically think of informality as a problem. And we should rather be finding ways to identify the assets that they develop or communities develop in informality, and then finding ways to incorporate maybe even healthy doses of informality into our urban planning, even in the developed world.
Enrique, How does it change the frame of this discussion to think about slums differently versus something that needs to be eradicated or replaced somehow?
First, thanks for the invitation, and it's always wonderful also to be paired in a conversation with Teresa. There's so much that I would echo from what she said. I think framing the issue is a really important thing to consider and to think critically about. And going back to your question, do we want to continue to look at slums as a problem to be solved, has a particular framing in it that I think, as Teresa has already alluded to, can be problematic because it misses a lot of things, and it weighs the concept down with things that might not be the problem. To kind of, again, echo something that she had said, if we're looking at slums as something to be solved, what is it that we want to solve about the slums? To that, I would say, to the extent that we care as a community, or that political leaders or community leaders care about the physical, social conditions under which many thousands of people live, environmentally, physical vulnerability, exposed to physical dangers, social dangers, and so forth, then yes, that we would want to solve that problem so people are less vulnerable and have a decent quality of life. Now, that's different than saying, do we want to solve the underlying conditions that generate that vulnerability? And that's something that from the Lincoln Institute we're very much interested in. And so when we think about informal settlements, and then I think that's a conversation we need to have too, is like, what is an informal settlement? When we think about how these human settlements arise and the vulnerabilities, we're looking at it from the perspective of the ways that land markets are functioning or not functioning, housing markets are functioning or not functioning. What's the reason or the reasons behind the waves of people looking for shelter and a place in the city that leads them to live under physically, environmentally precarious conditions? And as Teresa says, over time, too, these are places that actually resolve those problems on their own. There are policy interventions that could address that. But again, if we're concerned about those conditions, we have two types of problems. One, how to address the vulnerability. And then two, ultimately, how do you prevent them? But the prevention of that leads us to looking at a whole other set of problems. And again, from the Institute's perspective, it points us to the ways that land markets, housing markets work, and the access and availability that people have to decent, well-located housing in cities and services for that matter.
Well, let's talk more about some of the interventions that have been tried to date. Awarding title, which we've seen in Peru, or upgrading existing conditions like adding a cable car, as in Medellin, a library, clean water systems, or other urban amenities, including open space and parks that make life a little bit better in these communities.
So I'll go to a place that's dear to my heart, Chile. Chile is probably has almost, to a certain extent, in the Latin American context, eradicated informality or informal settlements, or slums as we're calling them. It's a very small percentage. And one of the ways that they did that over the last couple of decades was to develop a housing program based on this idea of subsidizing the demand for housing. So what they did was create a system and a market to ensure that people had access to affordable housing. And they reduced the rate of informality. At one point, I think it hit a low of 2% of people. It housed most of the population. It's looked at globally as a relatively successful housing program. Unfortunately, part of the solution, in order to get affordable housing at a scale that was required in the country, most of that housing was formal housing with title, with relatively good building conditions or monitored or regulated building conditions and construction material. To get it to be affordable and accessible to the number of people that required housing, that housing was placed in the periphery, and it was usually unplanned, and any thought about how it was integrated to the rest of the city was, at best, an afterthought. And people got housing. The precarious conditions were reduced considerably, but the unintended consequences was that we placed many of these people, particularly for the most part by the low-income household, out in the periphery, detached or under conditions that made it really difficult day in and day out to connect to the city and enjoy other quality of life that people with more resources and better locations to jobs could enjoy.
Teresa, this really addresses your concept of working with these communities in place versus, any sort of major relocations to housing on the outskirts, which for various reasons we've talked about, hasn't worked so well.
Yeah, it's deeply criticized in Brazil. It depends on the region. There's some parts of Brazil where the public housing program, which was federally mandated, in more distant parts or small municipalities that didn't have any infrastructure, it actually improved the infrastructure in that city overall because the federal mandates were better than what they had. But in large cities like in Rio, the public housing program has been, I think it's clearly a failure. It's been used to excuse forced evictions. So in the pre-Olympic period, the fact that we had this new public housing program building on the outskirts of the city gave the mayor sort of a political opportunity to evict 80,000 people and say, oh, well, we have somewhere to put you and it's better. And then, of course, this is where the issue of consolidation is important, because in consolidated informal settlements that have a strong sense of belonging and achievement and vibrancy and culture, and also the housing stock is not bad. It's not great, but it's not as bad as people think. When you relocate people to the outskirts, it's definitely a downgrade. It can be a very significant downgrade. Because public perception is so negative that favelas are these violent slums with no qualities to speak of, that seems to justify removals to the public, right? And then there's also the stigma issue. So, people in favelas are often criminalized for living in favelas, so they may think public housing is a better option and go until it's too late and they're out there, like Enrique said, with transportation issues, access to public services, hospitals, jobs, everything. I'll never forget one day I interviewed a woman in a community called Muzema. It's a favela next to the upscale Barra da Tijuca neighborhood. And she spent 15 minutes telling me how thrilled she was that she had finished her house. It was this beautiful house with so much detail and tile work and decorations. And she told me how she, her husband, and her 2 adult daughters had spent 15, 20 years building this house and preparing it and finishing it. And then all of a sudden, I was asking her about her job, and she said, she was a cleaner in this neighboring upscale neighborhood. And then she turns and says, well, I would live there if I could, but I can't, so I live here. And I was surprised because she had just talked about how much she loved this house she had built. And I said, well, why? Would you really prefer to be there? She said, I can't stand the way people look at me living here. And I said, oh, well, if that wasn't the perception, would you want to leave? And she said, oh, no, I'd never leave. And so it was just, I've heard many stories like that, but this was one where it was so clear that the stigma and the way she was perceived actually kept, her from fully enjoying her achievements and would have made her possibly choose a different outcome that was worse for her. I just want to add that, in Rio, again, we're talking about mostly consolidated informal settlements. 90% of them are built with brick, concrete, reinforced steel. They have indoor plumbing, electricity. We have limited public services. The water isn't maybe every day, but it's most of the time. Or we have, the trash pickup isn't as it should be, or the sewage system isn't well built. But there have been programs historically that have upgraded hundreds of favela communities and have improved them. And what residents generally want is more of those sorts of programs that actually upgrade what they have.
Well, continuing this theme of working with the communities that exist, can you tell us a little bit about a fresh approach we're seeing very recently, and that's community land trusts? Can you tell us a little bit the idea behind that, Teresa?
Yeah, well, it's borrowing the idea from, North America and Europe where it's more developed. So typically a community land trust in the U.S. or Europe, these are nonprofit associations that are created. They buy the land. They develop housing on that land. And then the trust owns the land, but the housing that they develop is either sold or rented or whatever affordably because the land value is removed from the sale value and other factors, that they regulate. Essentially, so the trust regulates that. And years ago, we started thinking, well, how would this work in informal settlements? Could this be a model of titling rather than titling land? And Fortunately, there's now an amazing case we're all learning from, not only us in Brazil, but people around the world have been visiting in Puerto Rico in the Caño Martín Peña communities, where about 20 years ago they decided, instead of getting individual land titles, that they would form a community land trust. They created a law for this. This is all through resident pressure on the authorities, because the residents knew that if they got individual titles, their community would be gentrified, they would lose their history and their accomplishments and their sense of community and so on. And so what they did was they formed a CLT where the land belongs to the community through this association, this community land trust, and the residents own the properties on that land. And they can buy and sell and inherit those properties, but they're kept affordable. And what they found in this process is they've become really powerful actors within San Juan, and they're next to the financial district. There hasn't been displacement anymore in the community. They're improving the canal next door. They're fighting to improve the conditions there. They do their own internal resettlement among residents, organizing this when they need to for their own safety, like with the hurricane. They also organized much more effectively than other informal settlements. When they need to negotiate with the authorities, they have much more power because they are a large landowner on very valuable land, instead of all these individual small units that kind of fight for their own needs. And so what we're doing in Rio is we've learned from this model, actually with support from the Lincoln Institute. Last year we had Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Last year we had 5 leaders from San Juan come to Rio. And we're working on this model in Brazil, where we see it as high potential because favelas are essentially informal community land trusts. The land tends to be publicly owned. The houses are bought and sold on an affordable market that's very active, and residents collectively organize for improvement. The problem is that because they do this informally, they can only do so much. They can still be evicted, even though there are squatters' rights, but they're not strong enough. Collective organizing is a lot harder without some sort of institution. And the land is still public, so the government can try to remove residents and so on. And so by sort of retrofitting favelas with a community land trust structure, we see a lot of potential in actually achieving large-scale integration of informal settlements in Brazil while we maintain the qualities, because each community can then organize its own development, develop working groups, which is what we're doing in Rio, with technical allies, architects, urban planners, engineers that are sort of at their service and supporting them. It just provides so much more potential for a community to improve rather than the sort of atomizing or pulverizing approach of individual land titles, which take a community that had all of these collective assets built up over time, all of a sudden become an individualistic, sort of market-oriented, the logic structure shifts. When you get individual land titles, your house is no longer as much a home and part of a community, and it's more an object that you can speculate on, that you might sell, that you see as an investment. So all of these things are sort of addressed through community land trust, and we're very hopeful about this approach in Brazil right now.
Well, this brings us to something else that's been happening, and that is essentially a process of gentrification that some areas, I'm thinking of Villa 31 in Buenos Aires, many other neighborhoods where there are essentially development pressures. Enrique, can community land trusts or some of these other approaches address that? I mean, is it even possible to sort of have this economic integration? And, how much do we need to be worried about people essentially being displaced?
The concern over people being displaced goes back to my original point. Like, if we're concerned about those things, then we need to focus on how to address them. And I can say that personally, I'm concerned about it. I think the Institute is concerned about displacement. And I think in the context, CLTs has the promise of and is proven to be a mechanism or a tool that allows for communities to confront what others have called the tyranny of the highest and best use of land. And I think one of the things I want to emphasize in this conversation about community land trusts, and something that's very of great interest to the Institute, is the whole point of, the reason or a underlying reason for informal settlements is driven by the the growing price of land and how inaccessible land is as a commodity or as a resource. And CLTs were designed, conceptualized in large part, to figure out a way to counter or address the increasing cost of land and make it somehow accessible to not necessarily, well, a community, a collective. This is something that we can't lose sight of. And to the extent that land is becoming, as we already know, increasingly expensive, the land values continue to soar. The more they soar, the more land and everything that's on land becomes inaccessible to many people that don't have the income or the resources to access it. We need to figure out tools that ensure that that resource is available, whether it's by subsidizing the purchase of land or by creating mechanisms that separate, as Teresa was describing about community land trust, separating the value of the land from the value of the property. Most of the cost in housing has less to do with the building itself and more with the cost of the land. And community land trusts try to address that. And the idea, as Teresa was saying, in this case in San Juan, the motivation for adopting a CLT in this community that's centrally located was to figure out a way to prevent individuals from succumbing to the lure of being bought out from a place that they've had developed, and they're being bought out in part because the value of the land, given that it was centrally located, is going up, and up. And the community in San Juan is, by adopting it, was basically saying we value this land for many more reasons other than the value of the land. And we understand that if you title and you provide title to individual households, the fabric of the community and the community's interests may unravel under the pressures of the demand for that land by others who have more resource and who can pay for it in ways that an individual household might not be able to pay for in perpetuity.
Well, a lot of what we've been talking about actually is some really positive things about these communities. And that leads me to my final question, which is popular media impressions of slums. And there's been a little bit of romanticizing, I think, that's gone on, whether it's Slumdog Millionaire or other films that celebrate to some degree life in slums. Some of the images we see that are so compelling, they depict a kind of terrible beauty in informal settlement. So I'm thinking about the popular and media impressions of these communities, maybe some things that are well worth celebrating, but maybe some things that are dangerous in some way in terms of public perception of these places that hundreds of millions of people live. Teresa, let's hear your thoughts on that, and then Enrique, you'll have the last word. This
is something that we've been working on in Rio for years because we had the pre-Olympic buildup when there was a lot of media presence in the city, and we've been really working on the narrative around favelas. Really what it comes down to is, how do residents feel? What do they think? Do they think it's a beautiful place? Do they think it's a place full of potential and culture and vibrancy? Or do they feel like it's desperate? And I think actually portraying those feelings in their diversity and plurality is really what needs to happen, because it really is diverse. And, favelas, informal settlements are very complex, very naturally very diverse places because they're unregulated. And so you get some communities that are those romantic images. They're real. They're not romantic. They are like that. Or, they're not fake. Where people are happy, where people know their neighbors, where there isn't drug trafficking. This exists in Rio. And there are other communities where it is desperate. And if you ask people, they say, get me out of here. And I would say asking residents is always an important way to do anything in these settlements, especially public policy. The thing is that the media responds to, the market, and news outlets only tend to cover favelas when there's a violent incident, not on a daily basis when people are just going about their lives trying to improve their neighborhoods, producing culture, producing development. And then editors want to appeal to the simplest understanding of these communities. So we've heard people say, well, I send an article to my editor talking about all these things, talking about favelas, and then they send it back and they use the word slum because that's the kind of lowest common denominator word that the average person will understand. There are a lot of issues involved here. A few years ago, I had a personal experience with a national TV network on a major U.S. program that shall go unnamed on this episode that came to Rio. They were doing a segment on violence in favelas, but we emphasized that police violence was a fundamental issue, and they were very interested, supposedly, and so we organized 2 days and actually got them interviews with some very important people who have been victimized by police violence. One of them was the wife of a bricklayer that was famously assassinated by over 20 police officers, an innocent bricklayer in a favela in 2013. And it was just a few weeks after his death, his torture. They interviewed his wife. The next day, they also did other interviews. When the segment came out, my jaw dropped. There were 20 minutes. It was 20 minutes long, and the entire thing was the guy I had spent 2 days with across the table from a drug trafficker who was threatening his life, showing all his drugs and weapons on the table. And, this is the kind of thing that happens. So the reality of lived experience by typical residents is rarely portrayed. And instead, or cases that need to be given visibility, that give perspective to the situation. And so I think it's important, but it's also, I think there's one other thing that I'd like to add, which is that the media are also responding to international development institutions, right? So this is all, in the case of Brazil, it's government. So government and the elite there's a perception of favelas that comes out and it's reflected in the Brazilian media. But internationally, it's international development institutions that do see slums as a problem to be solved. And that is the general idea, consensus. And so there's very little room when we all grow up thinking that to then have a more nuanced media coverage. That's a fundamental issue.
Enrique, some of this came up in our big conference at Harvard, the question of media portrayal of slums. Greater awareness and education is a good thing generally, but are there mixed messages that are coming out of this? Or what's your take on the media portrayal of informal settlement?
Well, there are definitely mixed messages and contradictions. Again, the basic one, it shows that, or ways in which the slum is glorified, and then other ways in which it's, at the same time it's glorified, it's vilified and seen as, shown as this kind of dark, deep thing that needs to be solved or avoided, or is marginal, or is worse yet, it's the other. It's a group of people, places that are not like us. Therefore, we should keep a distance. What I want to emphasize, and really there's not much more on the media and the challenges that to add to what Teresa was saying. What I think, from the perspective of the Lincoln Institute, one of the bigger challenges is to communicate and help mainstream an understanding of the ways that these land policy, housing markets, and housing trends are underpinning the rise of these communities and settlements, and have for centuries. More so now as the urban population is rapidly increasing. And I think that the challenge here is to connect how these markets and these forces work. Well, identify what the forces are, I think I'm getting myself into trouble by using the word forces because it makes it ambiguous and it's not specific enough. But to be more specific, how do we communicate the relevance of land markets and the way that affects the affordability of land, and through that the affordability of housing, and the importance of being well located in relationship to jobs and to services, all of that. How do they function? Why do they matter? And to do it in such a way that generates and creates empathy across social and economic classes. Because the story underpinning favelas, slums, villas, miserias, however you want to call them, is a story that actually should resonate with people that are struggling here in the United States, that don't think of themselves as living in a place with informality, but are dealing with an affordable housing crisis. There's a bridge between those two stories, and I think we need to do a better job. And if we do a better job, we will hopefully, this might sound naive, but get people to see the similarities and the common struggles, and then hopefully from there come up with and demand policies that allow us to live in well-located places under good physical conditions, and in places that promote, as Teresa's been saying throughout this podcast, that allow people to build the communities and thrive as communities now and over time and so forth. That's the bigger challenge. And I don't know if media, if we think of it in terms of the movies, could do that. I think, there are some good examples of it, but there's also just a broader general kind of educating of people about why is it difficult to buy a house or access a house or even rent and so forth. What does it mean that there's so many buildings going up in a place like Boston, but they're not necessarily building or housing units that are accessible to a family living with on a $60,000 or $80,000, if that, household income. The news just came out just today or yesterday. In order to rent a house in Boston, you might need to be making $34 an hour, something to that effect. I might need to check my facts, but I think those factoids or those things need to be discussed and explained. Why is that? What are the forces and factors that are driving that?
Well, it's a great way to conclude. We're looking at housing issues that extend well beyond the developing world, is what you're saying, is that there's a lot more that we can find in common in the U.S. In terms of the housing markets and development pressures and urbanization, just as much as Rio or other communities around the world in the developing world. So, well, there's a lot of complexity here. It's well worth understanding. Again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people living in often substandard conditions, and it's one of the stark realities of urbanization around the world. So Enrique Silva and Teresa Williamson, thank you for your insights. So that's it for this episode. We're going to be looking at all kinds of other elements of successful cities, from better ways to finance infrastructure to the renewal of smaller post-industrial cities. We're finding answers in land. Join us next time for Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm Anthony Flynn. Thanks for listening.